I was sitting alone at my kitchen table on what should have been the most celebrated day of my life, staring at the single cupcake I'd bought myself from the corner bakery. 80 years old today, and not one phone call, not one text message, not even a Facebook post from any of my 3 children or 7 grandchildren. But what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that while they were forgetting about me, I was remembering something very important about them. And tomorrow, when my lawyer reads my will at the family meeting I've called, they're going to discover that forgetting has consequences they never imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Mae Patterson, and I've lived in the same modest 2-bedroom house on Elm Street in Cedar Falls for the past 43 years. To anyone driving by, I look like exactly what I am. A retired elementary school teacher living on a fixed income, tending to my small garden, and making my weekly trips to the grocery store with carefully clipped coupons. My neighbors wave politely when they see me checking my mail or watering my roses, and I'm sure they think of me as just another elderly widow counting pennies and watching game shows. They have no idea that the woman who drives a 15-year-old Toyota Corolla and shops the clearance racks at Walmart is worth more than most of them will see in their lifetimes. It started with my late husband Frank's obsession with what he called boring investments. While his coworkers at the manufacturing plant were buying new trucks and taking expensive vacations, Frank was quietly putting every spare dollar into dividend-paying stocks, real estate investment trusts, and municipal bonds. He wasn't flashy about it, wasn't the type to brag about market gains or investment strategies. He just believed in compound interest and time, 2 things we had plenty of back then. When Frank passed away 7 years ago, I was devastated. We'd been married for 51 years, and I honestly didn't know how to live without him. But when the financial advisor Frank had been working with for decades came to my house to go over our assets, I nearly fainted. The man I'd shared a bed with for half a century, who'd never spent more than $30 on a pair of shoes and drove every car until it literally wouldn't start anymore, had quietly accumulated a portfolio worth $8.7 million. $8.7 million. Frank had left detailed instructions about what to do with the money. He wanted me to live comfortably but not extravagantly, to continue the investment strategy that had served us so well, and to eventually pass the wealth on to our children and grandchildren. But there was one specific instruction that would prove to be the most important of all. He wanted me to observe how our family treated me after he was gone, when I appeared to be just another struggling widow, before they learned about the inheritance that awaited them. Frank had always been quietly wise about human nature. He'd watched too many families torn apart by money, seen too many children who suddenly became attentive only when inheritance was involved. He wanted to know who would love Dorothy Mae Patterson the woman, not Dorothy Mae Patterson the millionaire. So we agreed, in those final months of his life, that I would keep our wealth secret until I felt ready to reveal it. 7 years later, on my 80th birthday, I was finally ready. The morning started like any other. I made my coffee in the same chipped mug I'd been using for 20 years, ate my oatmeal with fresh strawberries from my garden, and settled into Frank's old recliner to read the newspaper. The house was quiet in that particular way that only comes when you live alone, when every sound you make echoes slightly in rooms that used to be filled with conversation and laughter. I kept glancing at my phone, an ancient flip phone that my youngest son Danny had bought me 5 years ago, with strict instructions that it was only for emergencies. I'd never told him that I also had a smartphone, a sleek iPhone, that I used to monitor my investment accounts and stay connected with my financial advisor. The flip phone was just another part of the performance, another prop in the careful illusion of the struggling elderly mother. By 10 in the morning, I started making excuses for my children. Susan, my eldest, was probably busy with her law practice. She'd been a partner at Morrison, Webb & Associates for 12 years now, specializing in corporate law and working the kind of hours that left little time for family obligations. She lived in the expensive part of town with her husband Marcus, a cardiologist, in a house that cost more than most people's lifetime earnings. They had 2 children, Jennifer and Michael, both teenagers who attended private schools and spent their summers at exclusive camps. Susan had always been driven, even as a child. She was the one who color-coded her homework assignments and had her college applications completed 6 months before the deadlines. Success came naturally to her, but somewhere along the way, she'd started measuring everything in terms of productivity and return on investment, including relationships. My middle child, Robert, was a different story entirely. Bobby, as I still called him despite his 48 years, was a successful real estate developer who'd made millions flipping houses and developing shopping centers throughout the state. He lived even more extravagantly than Susan, with a mansion on the lake, 3 luxury cars, and a boat that cost more than most people's houses. His wife, Patricia, was a former beauty queen who'd never worked a day in her life, but had perfected the art of spending money on things that impressed other wealthy people. Bobby had 2 children as well, twins named Ashley and Andrew, who were now 22 and fresh out of expensive colleges. They'd both moved back home after graduation, seemingly in no hurry to start careers, when their trust funds provided more than enough spending money. Bobby had always been generous with his children, perhaps too generous, giving them everything they wanted before they even knew they wanted it. Then there was Danny, my baby, who at 45 still acted like the world owed him something. Danny had never quite found his direction in life, bouncing from job to job, relationship to relationship, always convinced that his next opportunity would be the one that finally made him rich and successful. He'd tried everything from selling insurance to starting a food truck business to becoming a day trader with money he didn't have. Each venture ended the same way, with Danny asking his siblings or me for loans to cover his mistakes. Danny lived in a small apartment across town and drove a car that was older than some of his coworkers. He was the one who called me most often, usually when he needed something, but sometimes just to complain about how unfair life had been to him. He was convinced that Susan and Bobby looked down on him, which wasn't entirely wrong, but he'd never understood that their disapproval had more to do with his attitude than his bank account. All 3 of my children had their own lives, their own problems, their own priorities. I understood that. What I didn't understand was how 3 people I'd raised, loved, and sacrificed for could completely forget the woman who'd given them life. By noon, I'd stopped making excuses. The phone calls I'd been expecting never came. The doorbell remained silent. My email inbox, which I checked on my secret smartphone, contained nothing but advertisements and notifications from my investment accounts. Even my mailbox held only bills and catalogs, no birthday cards from grandchildren who used to make me construction paper masterpieces covered in glitter and misspelled declarations of love. I made myself a grilled cheese sandwich for lunch, the same meal I'd been making for myself almost every day since Frank died. It was simple, cheap, and reminded me of the countless.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Lunches I'd prepared for my children when they were young and thought I was the most important person in their universe. Back then, a grilled cheese sandwich cut diagonally was an act of love, a small gesture that showed I cared about their preferences and happiness. Now, eating alone at my kitchen table on my 80th birthday, that same sandwich tasted like neglect. The afternoon stretched endlessly ahead of me. I tried to read, but couldn't concentrate. I attempted to work in my garden, but my heart wasn't in it. I even turned on the television, something I rarely did during the day, but the cheerful voices of talk show hosts and game show contestants only emphasized how quiet my own life had become. At 3 o'clock, I decided to take a walk through my neighborhood, partly for exercise, but mostly because I couldn't stand the silence of my house any longer. Cedar Falls was the kind of community where people still knew their neighbors, where children rode bicycles on sidewalks and families gathered on front porches in the evenings. It was a good place to grow old, or at least it should have been. Mrs. Henderson from next door was working in her flower bed when I passed by. She was 76, a widow like me, but she had 4 children who visited regularly, and grandchildren who spent weekends at her house building blanket forts and baking cookies. Her yard was always full of bicycles and chalk drawings on the driveway. "Beautiful day, isn't it, Dorothy?" she called out, wiping dirt from her hands on an old towel. "Lovely," I agreed, trying to keep the sadness out of my voice. "Doing anything special today?" she asked, and I realized she had no idea it was my birthday. Why would she? I'd never been the type to announce personal milestones or expect attention. "Just enjoying the sunshine," I replied, which was true enough. As I continued my walk, I passed other neighbors working in their yards, children playing in driveways, families loading up cars for what looked like birthday parties or family gatherings. The whole world seemed to be celebrating something, connecting with someone, sharing moments that would become memories. Everyone except me. I stopped at Riverside Park, the small playground where I'd brought my children countless times when they were young. The swings were different now. The slide had been replaced with a more modern version, but the giant oak tree where we used to have picnics was still there, still providing shade for families who understood that time together was precious. I sat on one of the benches and watched a young mother push her toddler on the swings. The little girl was laughing with pure joy, the kind of uninhibited happiness that only comes when you're completely secure in someone's love. The mother was patient and attentive, counting each push, celebrating each moment as if it were the most important thing in the world. That used to be me. I used to be the mother who counted pushes and celebrated small moments. I used to be the center of my children's universe, the person they ran to when they were hurt, the one whose approval mattered more than anything else. Somewhere along the way, I'd become optional in their lives, a duty to be managed rather than a person to be cherished. The realization hit me with surprising force. My children didn't just forget my birthday, they'd forgotten me. I walked home as the sun started to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that Frank would have called God's artwork. The house felt even emptier when I returned, but instead of sadness, I felt something else stirring inside me. It wasn't anger, exactly, and it wasn't hurt, though both of those emotions were certainly present. It was something harder and more determined. It was clarity. That evening, I did something I'd never done before. I opened a bottle of wine that Frank and I had been saving for a special occasion, a bottle that had been sitting in our small wine rack for over a decade. I poured myself a generous glass and sat in Frank's chair, looking around at the home we'd built together, the life we'd shared, the legacy we'd created. The legacy that was about to change hands in ways my children couldn't imagine. I thought about all the times over the past 7 years when my children had made it clear that I was an inconvenience in their busy lives. Susan, who scheduled our visits like business meetings and always seemed to be checking her phone while we talked. Bobby, who included me in family gatherings but treated me like a piece of furniture, someone to be polite to but not really engaged with. Danny, who only called when he needed money and spent most of our conversations complaining about how everyone else had it easier than he did. They'd all made assumptions about my financial situation, of course. They knew Frank had worked at the plant, knew we'd lived modestly, knew I was surviving on Social Security and a small teacher's pension. They probably thought I was struggling to maintain the house, worried about medical bills, carefully budgeting every dollar. They weren't entirely wrong about the budgeting part, but they had no idea that I was budgeting millions rather than hundreds. More importantly, they had no idea that I'd been watching them, studying them, learning who they really were when they thought no inheritance was at stake. The wine was excellent, smooth and rich, with flavors that had developed over years of patient waiting. It seemed appropriate somehow, drinking something that had been preserved and aged to perfection, just like the lesson I was about to teach my children about the value of patience and respect. As I sat there in the growing darkness, I made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow I would call my lawyer and arrange a family meeting. Tomorrow I would reveal the truth about Frank's investments and my own financial situation. Tomorrow my children would learn that their struggling elderly mother was actually wealthier than all of them combined. But more importantly, tomorrow they would learn what it cost to forget someone who'd never forgotten them. I finished my wine and went to bed that night with something I hadn't felt in years: anticipation. For 7 years I had been playing the role of the sad widow, living quietly and modestly, while my children lived their busy, important lives. Tomorrow, the performance would end, and the real Dorothy Mae Patterson would finally take center stage. The woman they'd forgotten was about to become unforgettable. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel possible. I woke up early, as I had every day for the past 60 years, but instead of my usual routine of coffee and newspaper, I made myself a proper breakfast. Scrambled eggs, bacon, fresh orange juice, and toast with the expensive jam I'd been saving for company that never came. If I was going to change my life today, I might as well start with a good meal. After breakfast, I retrieved my secret smartphone from its hiding place in my bedroom closet and scrolled through my investment accounts. The numbers were even more impressive than they'd been when I'd last checked. Compound interest working its magic while I slept. Frank would have been proud to see how well his careful strategy had continued to pay off, even without his guidance. I also checked my regular bank account, the one my children knew about, where I kept just enough money to maintain the illusion of modest means. The balance was intentionally low, just a few $1,000s that covered my monthly expenses, and gave my children the impression that I was living paycheck to paycheck like any other retiree. At exactly 9 o'clock, I called Harrison Webb & Associates, the law firm that had been handling Frank's estate and my financial affairs for the past 7 years. The receptionist put me through immediately to Thomas Harrison, a distinguished man in his 60s, who'd become not just my lawyer, but one of the few people who knew the truth about my situation. "Dorothy, how wonderful to hear from you," Thomas said warmly. "How was your birthday yesterday? Did the family surprise you?" Thomas was one of only 3 people who knew about Frank's fortune and my decision to keep it secret. The others were my financial advisor and my accountant, all bound by professional confidentiality and personal integrity. Thomas had been skeptical of my plan initially, worried that keeping such a large inheritance secret might cause problems later, but he'd come to understand my reasoning over the years. "Actually, Thomas, that's why I'm calling," I said, settling into Frank's chair with my coffee. "They didn't surprise me. They didn't call, didn't visit, didn't even send a card. I think it's time." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could picture Thomas leaning back in his leather chair, considering the implications of what I was saying. He'd been waiting for this call for 7 years, knowing that eventually I would decide whether my children had passed or failed the test Frank had designed. "Are you certain, Dorothy? Once we reveal the extent of your assets, there's no going back to the way things were." "I'm certain," I said firmly. "I want you to call a family meeting for this weekend. Tell them it's regarding my estate planning, and that attendance is mandatory. Don't give them any details beyond that. And the revelation? I want to do it properly. Drop all the documents, prepare a full disclosure of assets, and make sure they understand exactly what they've been taking for granted." I paused, thinking about the looks on their faces when they learned the truth. "Thomas, I also want you to prepare 3 different versions of my will. 3 versions? One that divides everything equally among them, as originally planned. One that adjusts the distribution based on their behavior over the past 7 years. And one that leaves everything to charity, with only token amounts for each of them." I took a sip of my coffee, surprised by how calm I felt. Which version becomes official will depend entirely on how they handle what they learn this weekend. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear him typing notes on his computer. "Dorothy, I have to ask, are you doing this for justice or for revenge?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself since last night. "I'm doing it for truth, Thomas. They need to understand that relationships have value, that people have worth beyond what they can provide financially. If that feels like revenge to them, perhaps that says more about their priorities than mine." We spent the next hour going over the details. Thomas would call each of my children that afternoon, scheduling the meeting for Saturday morning at his office. He'd be vague about the purpose, mentioning only that I wanted to discuss estate planning and ensure that my affairs were in order. Given my age and recent birthday, it would seem like a reasonable request from a responsible elderly parent. Meanwhile, I would prepare my own revelation, deciding exactly how much to tell them and in what order. Thomas suggested starting with the basics and building up to the full disclosure, giving them time to process each piece of information before delivering the next shock. After I hung up with Thomas, I spent the rest of the morning doing something I'd never done before. I researched my own children's financial situations. Using my smartphone and my surprisingly good internet skills, I looked up property records, business filings, and public information about their careers and lifestyles. What I discovered was both interesting and troubling. Susan, despite her successful law practice and high-earning husband, was living far beyond her means. Their expensive house carried a massive mortgage, their children's private school tuition was astronomical, and they'd taken out significant loans to maintain their lifestyle. On paper, they looked wealthy. In reality, they were leveraged to the breaking point and probably stressed about money constantly. Bobby's real estate empire was impressive, but built on a foundation of debt and speculation. He'd borrowed heavily to finance his developments, betting that property values would continue to rise indefinitely. His lifestyle was funded largely by credit and the assumption that his next project would be profitable enough to cover his current expenses. He was successful, but precariously so. Danny's situation was exactly what I'd expected: a series of failed ventures, mounting debts, and an increasing reliance on credit cards and family loans to survive. He was living paycheck to paycheck when he had a paycheck, and barely surviving when he didn't. All three of my children, despite their different levels of apparent success, were financially vulnerable in ways they probably didn't want to admit. All three could benefit enormously from an inheritance, but none of them had ever asked about my financial situation or offered to help with expenses they assumed I couldn't afford. The irony was almost too perfect. The children who'd forgotten about me financially were the same children who desperately needed financial help themselves. That afternoon, my phone rang 3 times in quick succession. First Susan, then Bobby, then Danny, each calling within minutes of speaking with Thomas Harrison. Their conversations were remarkably similar, starting with awkward apologies for missing my birthday and quickly moving to questions about the family meeting. "Mom, are you feeling all right?" Susan asked, her lawyer instincts immediately suspicious of any legal meeting she wasn't controlling. "Thomas Harrison wouldn't give me any details about why you want to discuss estate planning. Is there something wrong with your health?" "I'm feeling fine, sweetheart," I assured her, enjoying the term of endearment that I rarely heard from her anymore. "I just want to make sure my affairs are in order. At my age, it's the responsible thing to do." "Of course, but why now? Has something happened that I should know about?" "Susan, I'm 80 years old. Nothing needs to happen for me to want my children to understand my wishes." I kept my voice patient and reasonable, the tone I'd perfected during 40 years of teaching. "Will you be there Saturday morning?" "Yes, of course. Marcus and I will both be there. Should I bring the kids?" "Just adults, please. This is a serious discussion about serious matters." Bobby's call was more direct, as was his personality. "Mom, what's this about? Are you sick? Are you having money problems? Because if you need help with the house or medical bills, you know Patricia and I can." "Bobby, I'm not asking for money," I interrupted gently. "I'm asking for your presence at a family meeting. Can you manage that?" Sure, of course. It's just that you've never called a family meeting before, and with Thomas Harrison involved." "Mom, are you sure you're not in some kind of trouble?" "The only trouble I'm in, Bobby, is having children who think family meetings are suspicious instead of normal." Danny's call was the most emotional, as I'd expected. "Mom, I'm so sorry about yesterday. I had it written down wrong in my calendar. I thought your birthday was next week, and then with work being so crazy." His excuses tumbled out in a rush of guilt and anxiety. "Danny, it's all right," I said, though we both knew it wasn't entirely true. "These things happen." "No, it's not all right. I'm a terrible son, and I know it. And now, this meeting thing. Mom, if this is about money, if you need help, I might not be able to contribute much right now, but Danny, this meeting isn't about what I need from you. It's about what you need to know from me." "What does that mean?" "It means you'll find out on Saturday, along with your brother and sister." That evening, I did something else I'd never done before. I called my financial advisor, Margaret Chen, and asked her to prepare a complete portfolio summary for Saturday's meeting. Margaret had been managing my investments for the past 5 years, after Frank's original advisor retired, and she'd done an excellent job growing our already substantial wealth. "Mrs. Patterson, are you finally ready to tell your family about the inheritance?" Margaret asked. She was a sharp woman in her 40s who'd understood my situation immediately and had been discreetly helping me maintain my modest lifestyle while maximizing my investment returns. "I am. I want them to see exactly what Frank built, what I've preserved, and what they stand to inherit if they can learn to value family over convenience. Would you like me to attend the meeting?" Sometimes it helps to have a professional explain the technical aspects of wealth management. I considered this for a moment. Having Margaret there would add credibility to the revelation and help my children understand that this wasn't some fantasy or mistake. Yes, I think that would be very helpful. But Margaret, I want you to understand something. What my children learn about their inheritance this weekend will depend entirely on how they react to learning about it in the first place. You're still considering changes to the will based on their behavior? I'm considering everything based on their behavior. Frank always said that character is revealed in how people treat those who can't help them. For 7 years, my children have thought I couldn't help them financially. Now we'll see who they really are when they learn the truth. Friday passed slowly, but I used the time to prepare myself mentally for what was coming. I chose my outfit carefully. A simple but well-made dress that I'd owned for years, modest jewelry, comfortable shoes. I wanted to look like the Dorothy Mae Patterson my children thought they knew, not like a woman with millions in the bank. I also prepared emotionally for the range of reactions I might see. Shock, certainly. Anger, possibly, especially from children who might feel deceived. Relief, probably, particularly from Danny, who would immediately see the inheritance as a solution to his financial problems. What I hoped to see, but wasn't sure I would, was understanding. Understanding of why Frank and I had made this choice, why we'd needed to know who they really were when they thought nothing was at stake. That night, I lay in bed thinking about Frank and wondering what he would say about the choice I was making. He'd designed this test, but he'd never had to live through it. He'd never had to watch his children forget his birthday, never had to feel invisible in their lives, never had to question whether they loved him or just tolerated him. But I knew what Frank would say. He'd tell me that love without respect isn't really love at all, and that respect has to be earned as much as given. He'd remind me that we'd raised our children to be independent and successful, but that independence shouldn't come at the cost of basic human decency. Most importantly, he'd tell me that the money was never the point. The money was just a tool, a way of measuring what people truly valued when they thought no one was watching. Tomorrow, my children would learn that someone had been watching all along. Tomorrow, the woman they'd forgotten would remind them that forgetting has consequences. And tomorrow, Dorothy Mae Patterson would finally stop being invisible in her own family's life. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of overcast sky that matched my mood perfectly. I dressed carefully in my navy blue dress, the one I'd worn to Frank's funeral and every other serious occasion since then. It was respectable without being expensive, appropriate for a woman of modest means discussing her final wishes. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was essentially attending my own financial funeral, the death of the persona I'd maintained for 7 years. I arrived at Harrison Webb & Associates 15 minutes early, as was my habit. The law office occupied the top 2 floors of the oldest building in downtown Cedar Falls, with mahogany paneling and leather-bound books that spoke of tradition and respectability. Thomas had chosen the main conference room for our meeting, an impressive space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the town square and a table large enough to seat 12 people comfortably. Margaret Chen arrived shortly after I did, carrying a leather briefcase that I knew contained detailed reports of every investment, every dividend, every carefully calculated decision that had turned Frank's modest savings into a fortune. She was an elegant woman with silver-streaked hair and the kind of quiet confidence that came from decades of managing other people's money successfully. "How are you feeling, Mrs. Patterson?" Margaret asked as we settled into chairs at one end of the conference table. "Nervous," I admitted. "I've been playing a role for so long that I'm not sure I remember how to be myself around them." Thomas entered the room carrying several thick folders and what looked like multiple copies of legal documents. He'd been my lawyer for nearly a decade, but today felt different somehow, more formal and consequential than our usual meetings about tax planning and investment strategies. "Dorothy, I want to go over the agenda once more before they arrive," Thomas said, arranging his papers with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered. "We'll start with general estate planning discussion, then move to asset disclosure, and finally present the inheritance options based on their reactions." I nodded, my hands folded in my lap like a schoolgirl waiting for a test to begin. In many ways, that's exactly what this was, a test that had been 7 years in the making. At precisely 10 o'clock, I heard voices in the reception area. Susan's crisp professional tone, Bobby's louder laugh, and Danny's nervous chatter as they were escorted down the hallway. The door opened, and my 3 children entered the conference room with expressions ranging from curious to concerned to barely concealed irritation. Susan looked exactly as I'd expected, dressed in a charcoal gray business suit that probably cost more than I spent on clothing in a year. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and she carried herself with the rigid posture of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. Her husband Marcus followed behind her, equally polished and professional in his expensive suit and designer tie. Bobby entered with his usual swagger, wearing khakis and a polo shirt that managed to look both casual and expensive simultaneously. His wife Patricia clung to his arm, her blonde hair perfectly styled and her jewelry catching the light from the conference room windows. Everything about them screamed success and prosperity, from Patricia's designer handbag to Bobby's expensive watch. Danny came in last, looking uncomfortable in a suit that was slightly too big for him, and obviously borrowed or bought secondhand. His hair needed cutting, and he kept tugging at his tie like it was strangling him. He glanced around the conference room with the expression of someone who felt outclassed and knew it. "Mom, you look lovely," Susan said, kissing my cheek with the efficiency of someone checking an item off a to-do list. "How are you feeling?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. Thank you all for coming." Bobby settled into a chair across from me with the casual authority of someone accustomed to running meetings. "So, Mom, what's this all about?" Thomas was pretty mysterious on the phone. "I wanted to discuss my estate planning with all of you," I said simply. "At my age, it's important to make sure everything is in order." "Of course," Marcus said in his bedside manner voice, the same tone he probably used with elderly patients. "It's very responsible of you to think ahead like this." Thomas cleared his throat and began with the script we'd rehearsed. "Mrs. Patterson has asked me to review her current financial situation with the family and discuss her wishes regarding inheritance and end-of-life planning." "Are you sick, Mom?" Danny asked anxiously, leaning forward in his chair. "Is there something you're not telling us?" "I'm not sick, Danny. I'm just being practical." Susan opened a leather portfolio and pulled out a legal pad, apparently ready to take notes. "What exactly are we discussing here? Assets? Debts? Medical directives?" "Let's start with assets," Thomas said, opening the first folder. "Mrs. Patterson, would you like to begin, or shall I?" I took a deep breath, feeling like an actress about to deliver the most important lines of her career. "I suppose I should start by telling you that things aren't exactly what they've seemed for the past 7 years." The room fell silent. Even Patricia, who'd been examining her manicure, looked up with sudden interest. "What do you mean, Mom?" Bobby asked, his businessman instincts clearly picking up on something significant. "I mean that your father was much better with money than any of us realized, and I've been much more comfortable financially than I've let on." Susan's pen stopped moving across her legal pad. "Mom, are you saying you have more money than we thought?" "Significantly more." Margaret opened her briefcase and pulled out a bound report, setting it in the center of the table where everyone could see it. The cover page read, "Patterson Family Trust Portfolio Summary," in embossed letters that seemed to glow under the conference room lights. "This is a complete accounting of your mother's current assets," Margaret said in her professional voice. "I think you'll find the numbers quite surprising." Susan reached for the report first, her lawyer instincts taking over. She opened it to the summary page, and I watched her face change from mild curiosity to shock to something approaching disbelief. "This says," she paused, looking at the numbers again. "This says you have over $9 million in investments alone." The words hung in the air like smoke from an explosion. Bobby's mouth fell open. Danny made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. Marcus leaned over to read the report over Susan's shoulder, his composed expression cracking slightly. "9 million?" Bobby repeated, his voice climbing an octave. "Mom, is this accurate?" "It's accurate," I confirmed calmly. "Your father started investing in the stock market when you children were young. He was very good at it, very patient, very disciplined." When he died, he left me with a substantial portfolio that I've continued to manage carefully. Patricia grabbed the report from Susan's hands, scanning the pages with the intensity of someone reading a treasure map. This shows real estate holdings, municipal bonds, dividend stocks. Dorothy, you're wealthy. I'm comfortable, I corrected. Danny was staring at me like I'd grown a second head. Mom, if you have $9 million, why are you living in that tiny house? Why are you driving that old car? Why have you been living like you're poor? It was the question I'd been waiting for, the one that would lead to the real conversation we needed to have. Because I wanted to know who you were when you thought I had nothing to offer you. The silence that followed was profound. I could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the distant sound of traffic from the street below, the almost imperceptible hum of the air conditioning. But from my children, nothing. Susan was the first to find her voice. What do you mean by that? I mean that your father and I decided, before he died, that I would keep our financial situation private for a while. We wanted to see how our family treated me when they thought I was just another struggling widow. That's? Bobby started, then stopped, apparently unable to find words for what that was. That's manipulative, Susan finished, her lawyer training helping her recover faster than her siblings. Mom, you've been lying to us for 7 years. I've been observing you for 7 years, I corrected. There's a difference. Danny was shaking his head repeatedly, like he was trying to clear water from his ears. I don't understand. You've been rich this whole time, and you let me struggle? You let me ask for loans when you could have helped me without even noticing the money? Danny, when did you ask for help? When did any of you ask how I was doing financially? In 7 years, not one of you has inquired about my budget, my expenses, or whether I needed assistance with anything. Margaret had been watching this exchange with the detached interest of a professional observer. Now she spoke up. If I may, Mrs. Patterson's financial situation has actually improved significantly since her husband's death. The original inheritance of $8.7 million has grown to over $9.3 million through careful investment and reinvestment of dividends. $9.3 million, Marcus repeated slowly, as if testing how the words sounded. But that's not all, Thomas said, opening another folder. There's also the house, which Mrs. Patterson owns free and clear, valued at approximately $250,000, plus a savings account, checking account, and various CDs and money market accounts totaling another $400,000. Susan was frantically scribbling numbers on her legal pad. So we're talking about $10 million total? Approximately, yes. Bobby leaned back in his chair, running his hands through his hair. Mom, this is incredible. Do you understand what this means? You're set for life. You could travel, buy a new house, live anywhere you want. I could, I agreed. But I chose to live modestly and observe my children instead. Observe us for what? Patricia demanded, her voice sharp with something that might have been anger or embarrassment. To see if you loved me or just tolerated me. To see if you valued me as a person or just as an obligation. To see who you really were when you thought nothing was at stake. The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. I could see my children processing what I was saying, beginning to understand the implications of my words. And what did you observe? Susan asked, her lawyer voice carefully neutral. I took a breath, knowing that what I said next would change our relationships forever. I observed that in 7 years, you've treated me like an inconvenience. Susan, you schedule our visits like business meetings and spend most of our time together checking your phone. Bobby, you include me in family gatherings, but you don't actually engage with me, you just tolerate my presence. Danny, you only call when you need something, and you spend our conversations complaining about how unfair life has been to you. Mom, that's not fair, Bobby protested. We've all been busy, we've had our own lives to manage. I know you've been busy. I also know that you found time for the things that mattered to you. You found time for work, for friends, for activities, for everything except your mother. Danny was looking increasingly agitated. So this whole thing, this whole meeting, is what, a lecture about how we're terrible children? No, Danny. This meeting is about giving you a chance to understand what you've been taking for granted. Thomas cleared his throat diplomatically. Mrs. Patterson asked me to prepare several different versions of her will, depending on how this conversation went. Several versions? Susan's attention sharpened immediately. Version 1 divides the estate equally among the 3 children, as originally planned. Version 2 adjusts the distribution based on their behavior over the past 7 years. Version 3 leaves the bulk of the estate to charity, with only modest bequests for each child. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Patricia's face had gone pale, and she was gripping Bobby's arm tightly enough to leave marks. Danny looked like he might be sick. "You're threatening to disinherit us?" Bobby asked incredulously. "I'm explaining that inheritance is a privilege, not a right," I replied. "Your father and I worked very hard to build this wealth. We saved, we sacrificed, we made careful decisions for decades. We didn't do that so our children could ignore us and then benefit from our work." Susan had regained her composure and was back in lawyer mode. "Mom, I understand you're upset about the birthday situation, and we've already apologized for that. But this seems like an extreme reaction to what was essentially a scheduling mistake." "A scheduling mistake?" I felt my voice rising for the first time. "Susan, you didn't just forget my birthday, you've forgotten me. When was the last time you called just to talk? When was the last time you asked about my day, my health, my happiness? When was the last time you treated me like a person, instead of an obligation?" "Mom, we've been respectful." "Respectful?" I stood up from my chair, feeling anger I'd been suppressing for years, finally breaking free. Respectful would be calling occasionally. Respectful would be including me in decisions that affect the family. Respectful would be treating me like someone whose opinions and feelings matter. Margaret and Thomas exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that the conversation was moving beyond legal technicalities into emotional territory that couldn't be resolved with documents and procedures. "You want to know what I observed?" I continued, pacing to the window and looking out at the town square where Frank and I used to take walks every evening. "I observed that, Susan, despite your successful career, you're leveraged to the breaking point trying to maintain a lifestyle you can't actually afford. Bobby, your real estate empire is built on borrowed money and speculation, and you're one bad investment away from losing everything. Danny, you're drowning in debt and failed ventures, but you've never once asked if your elderly mother might need help with her own expenses." I turned back to face them, seeing my children clearly for perhaps the first time in years. "You've all been so busy managing your own financial stress that you never considered that I might have wisdom, resources, or assistance to offer. You just assumed I was another burden to bear." "That's not true," Danny protested weakly, "isn't it? Danny, how many times have you called me in the past year?" He opened his mouth, then closed it, apparently trying to count. "I'll tell you, 14 times. 11 of those calls were asking for money or help with something. 2 were obligatory holiday calls. 1 was to tell me you'd changed your phone number. Not once did you call just to see how I was doing." Danny's face was red with embarrassment or anger, I couldn't tell which. "And Bobby, you've included me in exactly 4 family gatherings in the past 2 years. Christmas, Easter, your anniversary party, and Ashley's graduation. At each event, you introduced me as your mother and then ignored me for the rest of the evening while you entertained your friends and business associates." Bobby was staring at the table, unable to meet my eyes. "Susan, you visited me 6 times in the past year. Every visit was scheduled in advance, lasted exactly 1 hour, and followed the same pattern: polite conversation about my health, brief updates about your children, and careful avoidance of any topic that might require emotional investment." Susan's professional composure was cracking. "Mom, we thought you preferred your independence. You never asked for more attention. I shouldn't have to ask my children to care about me." The room fell silent again. I could see them processing what I'd said, beginning to understand how their behavior looked from my perspective. But I wasn't finished. "The money isn't the point," I continued, returning to my seat. "The money is just a way of measuring what you value. For 7 years, you've all believed I was poor, struggling, possibly in need of assistance. Not once did any of you offer help. Not once did any of you express concern about my financial situation. Not once did any of you treat me like someone whose welfare mattered to you." Margaret spoke up quietly. Mrs. Patterson, perhaps this would be a good time to explain the inheritance options in more detail. Thomas nodded and pulled out 3 different documents. As I mentioned, we've prepared 3 different wills. The first leaves everything divided equally, approximately $3.1 million each, plus equal shares in the house and other assets. I watched my children's faces as they absorbed this information. Even divided 3 ways, it was more money than any of them had ever imagined inheriting. The second will adjusts the distribution based on relationship and behavior. In this version, the child who has shown the most care and respect receives 50%, while the others receive 25% each. Susan was clearly doing math in her head, probably trying to calculate which of them might be considered most deserving. The third will leaves 90% of the estate to various charities, with modest bequests of $50,000 each for the children. Danny made a strangled noise. 50,000? Mom, you can't be serious. I'm completely serious. The question is, which version becomes official depends entirely on what happens in this room today. Bobby leaned forward, his business instincts finally kicking in. What do you want from us, Mom? What would it take to ensure we're considered deserving of the inheritance? The question revealed so much about his mindset that I almost laughed. Even now, even after everything I'd said, he was thinking in terms of transactions and negotiations. Bobby, I don't want anything from you. I want to know who you are. I want to understand what kind of people your father and I raised. I want to see if you're capable of loving someone who can't do anything for you. Patricia finally spoke up, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Dorothy, surely you understand that everyone gets busy, everyone has priorities. That doesn't mean we don't love you. Patricia, in the 5 years you've been part of this family, how many conversations have you and I had that weren't about Bobby or the children? She opened her mouth, then closed it, clearly unable to think of any. How many times have you asked about my interests, my opinions, my experiences? How many times have you treated me like a person worth knowing, instead of just Bobby's mother? The silence stretched on until Marcus, who'd been quietly observing the entire exchange, finally spoke. Mrs. Patterson, I think what you're describing is unfortunately common in many families. People get caught up in their daily responsibilities and take their relationships for granted. That doesn't necessarily mean they don't care. I studied my son-in-law, this successful cardiologist who'd married my daughter and given me 2 grandchildren I barely knew. Marcus, that's a very diplomatic way of saying that neglect is normal and should be accepted. I'm saying that people show love in different ways, and maybe your children show love through respect for your independence rather than through constant contact. And I'm saying that independence and isolation aren't the same thing. Susan had been quiet during this exchange, but now she looked up from her legal pad, with the focused intensity that made her such a successful attorney. Mom, let's be practical here. What specifically do you want from us going forward? What would constitute acceptable behavior in your eyes? It was such a typical Susan question, reducing complex emotional needs to a checklist of requirements. But it was also an opportunity to be clear about my expectations. I want to be included, not just tolerated. I want to be consulted about family decisions, especially ones that affect me. I want phone calls that aren't requests for money or obligatory check-ins. I want to be treated like someone whose thoughts and feelings matter. And if we do those things, Bobby asked carefully, the inheritance returns to the original equal distribution? I looked at my middle son, this successful businessman who was still thinking in terms of quid pro quo, and felt a profound sadness settle over me. Bobby, the fact that you're asking that question tells me you still don't understand what this is about. Then explain it to me, because I'm completely lost here. I stood up again, needing to move, needing to find the right words for what might be my last chance to reach my children. This isn't about earning an inheritance. This isn't about meeting requirements or fulfilling obligations. This is about understanding that love requires attention, that relationships require investment, that family means more than sharing DNA and legal obligations. I walked to the window again, looking out at the town square where Frank and I had spent so many peaceful evenings. Your father designed this test because he understood something that I'm not sure you do. That wealth without character is meaningless, that success without compassion is empty, and that inheritance without love is just money changing hands between strangers. When I turned back to face them, I saw 3 adults who looked like my children but felt like strangers. People who shared my blood but not my values. The inheritance is yours if you want it, but I need to know that you want the woman who comes with it, not just the money she's leaving behind. The silence in the conference room stretched like a taut wire ready to snap. I could see my children struggling with the weight of my words, the reality of their situation finally sinking in. They weren't just learning about an unexpected inheritance. They were being forced to confront 7 years of choices, 7 years of taking me for granted, 7 years of treating me like furniture in their own lives. Danny was the first to break. "Mom, I'm sorry, okay? I'm really sorry. I know I've been selfish. I know I've only called when I needed something, but I can change. I can be better." His voice was desperate, pleading, and I could see the panic in his eyes as he calculated what $50,000 versus $3 million would mean for his perpetually struggling finances. "Danny," I said gently, "I don't want you to change because of the money. I want you to change because you understand that I'm a person who deserves love and respect." "I do understand that. I've always loved you, Mom. I've been so caught up in my own problems that I didn't realize how I was treating you." Susan had been scribbling notes furiously, her legal mind clearly working through the implications of everything she'd heard. "Mom, I think we need to separate the emotional issues from the practical ones here. Yes, we've all been remiss in our attention to you, and we apologize for that. But threatening to disinherit us seems like an extreme response to what are essentially communication problems." I turned to look at my eldest daughter, this brilliant woman who could argue complex cases in front of judges but couldn't seem to understand the simple concept of treating her mother with kindness. "Susan, do you hear yourself right now? You're talking about my feelings like they're a legal brief to be dissected and dismissed. You're treating this conversation like a negotiation instead of a family discussion. I'm trying to find a practical solution to this situation. The situation is that you don't know how to love me without conditions." Bobby had been quiet during this exchange, but now he leaned forward with the earnest expression he used when trying to close difficult real estate deals. "Mom, look, I'll be honest with you. Patricia and I have been under a lot of financial pressure lately. The development projects haven't been performing as well as expected, and we've borrowed heavily to maintain our lifestyle. When I found out about your inheritance today, my first thought was relief. Relief that I wouldn't have to worry about providing for you in your old age. Relief that there would be something left for our kids' future." At least he was being honest, which was more than I could say for his siblings. "But that doesn't mean I don't care about you as a person," Bobby continued. "It just means I've been so stressed about money that I haven't been thinking clearly about anything else." Patricia nodded vigorously beside him. "Dorothy, Bobby's been working 18-hour days trying to keep the business afloat. We've both been so worried about our own financial situation that we haven't had the emotional energy to focus on family relationships the way we should have. I studied my daughter-in-law, this woman who'd married into our family but had never really joined it. Patricia, in 5 years of marriage to my son, you've never once asked me about my life before you knew Bobby. You've never shown interest in my teaching career, my hobbies, my memories of raising your husband. You've treated me like a stranger you're obligated to be polite to." "That's not true," she protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "When was the last time you and I had a conversation that wasn't about your children, your house, your vacation plans, or your social events?" Patricia opened her mouth to respond, then closed it, clearly unable to think of a single example. Margaret had been observing this exchange with professional detachment, but now she spoke up. "Mrs. Patterson, perhaps this would be a good time to discuss the practical implications of each inheritance option." Thomas nodded and pulled out a calculator. "Let's break down the numbers. Under the equal distribution plan, each child receives approximately $3.1 million, plus equal shares in the house and other assets. Under the merit-based plan, the distributions would vary significantly depending on Mrs. Patterson's assessment of each child's behavior." "And under the charity plan?" Marcus asked quietly. Each child receives $50,000. The rest goes to organizations that Mrs. Patterson has selected based on causes that were important to her and her late husband. Danny's face had gone pale. Mom, $50,000 wouldn't even cover my current debt. I'd still be bankrupt. Danny, your financial problems aren't my responsibility to solve. They're your responsibility to learn from. But you could help me. You could change my entire life with just a fraction of what you have. I could, but should I? Should I reward 20 years of poor financial decisions and 7 years of neglecting your mother by handing you millions of dollars? Susan had apparently been doing legal research on her phone while we talked. Mom, I have to point out that if you're making inheritance decisions based on personal grievances, that could potentially be challenged in court as undue influence or lack of testamentary capacity. The room fell silent. I stared at my eldest daughter, the child I'd raised to be strong and independent, who was now threatening to challenge my mental competence because she didn't like my decisions about my own money. Susan, I said very quietly, did you just threaten to have me declared mentally incompetent if I don't give you the inheritance you think you deserve? She backpedaled quickly, realizing how her words had sounded. I'm not threatening anything. I'm just pointing out the legal realities of estate planning. The legal reality is that this is my money, and I can leave it to whoever I choose for whatever reasons I choose. Thomas cleared his throat diplomatically. Actually, Mrs. Patterson's testamentary capacity is clearly established. She's been managing complex financial decisions successfully for years, and her reasoning for the inheritance conditions is sound and well documented. I wasn't suggesting otherwise, Susan said defensively. I was just exploring all possibilities. You were threatening to challenge my will if I don't give you what you want. There's a difference. The mask had finally slipped. My children weren't just surprised by the revelation of my wealth. They were angry that I had the audacity to attach conditions to it. They felt entitled to an inheritance they'd never known existed, simply by virtue of being my offspring. Bobby tried a different approach. Mom, let's talk about this practically. What would it take for us to prove that we've learned from this experience? What specific actions would demonstrate that we value you as a person, not just as a source of inheritance? Again, with the transactional thinking. Everything was a deal to be negotiated, a problem to be solved with the right combination of actions and words. Bobby, the fact that you're asking that question proves you still don't understand. Then help me understand. Tell me what you want. I stood up and walked to the far end of the conference room, needing distance from the desperation and confusion radiating from my children. Through the tall windows, I could see ordinary people going about their Saturday morning routines. Families walking together, couples holding hands, children playing in the park. Normal people living normal lives, taking care of each other without needing financial incentives to do so. I want what every parent wants, I said without turning around. I want to know that I raised children who are capable of love, not just self-interest. I want to know that the people I devoted my life to see me as more than an obligation or an inheritance opportunity. We do see you as more than that, Danny said earnestly. Mom, I love you. I've always loved you. Danny, love is a verb, not just a feeling. Love requires action, attention, investment. For 7 years, you've shown me that you love the idea of having a mother, but you don't actually love the work of being a son. I turned back to face them, seeing my children clearly for perhaps the first time in decades. Not as the people I'd hoped they would become, but as the people they actually were. I'm going to tell you something that might surprise you, I continued. I don't need your money. I don't need your help. I don't need anything from any of you except basic human decency. But apparently, that's too much to ask. That's not fair, Susan protested. We've never been cruel to you. We've never mistreated you. Neglect is a form of mistreatment, Susan. Indifference is a form of cruelty. Taking someone for granted is a way of devaluing them. Marcus had been quietly observing the entire exchange, and now he spoke up with the measured tone he probably used with difficult patience. Mrs. Patterson, I think what your children are trying to say is that they recognize their mistakes and want to make amends. Isn't that worth something? I studied my son-in-law, this man who'd been part of our family for 15 years, but had never really invested in knowing me as an individual. Marcus, in all the years you've been married to my daughter, how many times have you and I had a personal conversation? How many times have you asked about my interests, my opinions, my experiences? How many times have you treated me like a person worth knowing instead of just Susan's mother? He was quiet for a long moment, clearly thinking. I suppose I've always deferred to Susan when it came to family relationships. You've used Susan as a buffer so you wouldn't have to invest emotionally in a relationship with me. That wasn't intentional. Intent doesn't matter when the result is the same. I returned to my seat at the conference table, feeling suddenly exhausted. This wasn't going the way I'd hoped. I'd imagined this moment for months, but I'd somehow expected more from my children. I'd expected recognition, remorse, genuine understanding of what they'd put me through. Instead, I was getting negotiations and legal threats and promises that felt hollow because they were motivated by money rather than love. Let me ask you all a question, I said, looking around the table at these three adults who shared my DNA but seemed to share little else with me. If I hadn't revealed the inheritance today, if I'd simply told you how your behavior had hurt me over the past 7 years, what would you have done? The question hung in the air unanswered, and I could see the truth in their expressions. Without the financial incentive, this conversation never would have happened. My feelings would have been dismissed as the oversensitivity of an elderly woman, my complaints brushed aside as the inevitable friction between generations. You would have apologized politely and then continued treating me exactly the same way, I answered my own question. Because my feelings only matter now that you know there's money attached to them. Danny was crying now, tears streaming down his face as the reality of his situation sank in. Mom, please, I know I've been a terrible son, but I can change. I can be better. Please don't punish me for the rest of my life because of my mistakes. Danny, this isn't punishment. This is consequences. There's a difference. But you could help me start over. You could give me a chance to prove that I can be responsible with money, that I can build a stable life. With whose money, Danny? With the money your father and I saved by denying ourselves luxuries? By working extra jobs? By making sacrifices you've never even known about? I didn't know you were making sacrifices. Because you never asked. In 7 years, you never once inquired about my budget, my expenses, my financial situation. You just assumed I was fine and left me to handle everything alone. Bobby had been doing calculations on his phone, probably trying to figure out how much the revelation would cost him if I followed through on my threats. Mom, I want to understand something. You said Dad designed this test before he died. Did he want you to disinherit us if we failed? It was a good question, one that cut to the heart of everything Frank and I had discussed during those final months of his life. Your father wanted me to know who you really were, I said carefully. He wanted me to see if you would love me when you thought I couldn't help you financially. He wanted me to understand whether I'd raised children or just people who happened to be related to me. And, what's your conclusion? Susan asked, her voice tight with barely controlled emotion. I looked around the table at these three people I'd loved unconditionally for decades, these children I'd sacrificed for, worried about, celebrated with, and mourned with. I saw Susan, brilliant and successful, but emotionally unavailable. Bobby, charming and ambitious, but fundamentally selfish. Danny, struggling and desperate, but unable to take responsibility for his own choices. My conclusion is that you're all exactly who you've chosen to be, I said sadly. And unfortunately, the people you've chosen to be are not the kind of people who deserve to inherit the fruit of their parents' lifetime of work. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief that spread across the table. Mom, you can't mean that, Bobby said desperately. I mean every word of it. Susan had recovered her composure and was back in full attorney mode. So you're going with the charity option? $50,000 each and the rest to organizations we've never heard of? I'm going with the option that reflects the reality of our relationships. Thomas had been preparing documents throughout our conversation, and now he pulled out a folder containing what looked like the final version of my will. Mrs. Patterson, if you're certain about this decision, we can execute the paperwork today. I'm certain. Danny made one last desperate attempt. Mom, what if we promise to change? What if we sign contracts promising to call you weekly, visit monthly, include you in family decisions? Would that change your mind? I looked at my youngest child, this man who still thought love could be reduced to a series of contractual obligations, and felt my heart break a little more. Danny, if you need a contract to remember to love your mother, then you've already proven that you don't. Margaret had been quietly observing this family drama unfold, but now she spoke up with professional concern. Mrs. Patterson, are you certain you want to make such significant decisions in the heat of emotion? Perhaps it would be wise to take some time to consider all the implications. I've had 7 years to consider the implications, I replied. I've watched my children show me exactly who they are when they thought nothing was at stake. I don't need more time to understand what I've learned. Patricia, who'd been silent for most of the conversation, suddenly burst into tears. Dorothy, please reconsider. Bobby and I have made mistakes, but we have children to think about. Ashley and Andrew are just starting their lives. They don't deserve to be punished for our failures as family members. It was the first time Patricia had shown genuine emotion during the entire meeting, and I could see the terror in her eyes as she contemplated what losing a multi-million-dollar inheritance would mean for their over-leveraged lifestyle. Patricia, my grandchildren have trust funds that Bobby established years ago. They're not going to suffer because of this decision. But what about their future? College, graduate school, helping them buy houses, start businesses. What about it? Bobby and Susan both built successful careers without inheritance money. Danny has struggled, but not because he lacked financial support. Character isn't inherited, Patricia. It's developed through experience, including the experience of working for what you want. Susan had been furiously typing on her phone during this exchange, and now she looked up with the focused intensity that made her such a formidable attorney. Mom, I've been researching the legal precedents for inheritance disputes based on family relationship issues. There are definitely grounds for challenging a will that disinherits children based on subjective assessments of their behavior. Susan, are you seriously sitting here threatening to sue me because I won't give you money you never knew existed until 2 hours ago? I'm exploring all options to protect my family's interests. Your family's interests? What about my interests? What about my right to dispose of my own assets as I see fit? Of course you have that right. But when emotional trauma influences financial decisions? Emotional trauma? I stood up abruptly, feeling anger surge through me like electricity. Susan, you think being ignored and neglected by my own children for 7 years constitutes emotional trauma that impairs my judgment? I think grief and loneliness can sometimes lead to decisions that don't reflect a person's true wishes. My true wishes are to be treated with love and respect by my family. Since that apparently isn't possible, my true wishes are to leave my money to organizations that will use it to help people who understand the value of compassion and human dignity. Thomas had been taking notes throughout this exchange, and now he looked up with the grim expression of someone who'd seen too many families destroyed by money. If we're going to proceed with the final will, I need to make sure Mrs. Patterson understands the irreversibility of this decision. I understand completely. And you're certain that this reflects your wishes, free from coercion or undue influence? Thomas, the only influence I'm under is the influence of 7 years of experience with my children's true character. Danny had stopped crying and was now staring at me with something approaching desperation. Mom, what if I move closer to you? What if I come by every day, help with errands, spend time with you? Would that prove that I care about you as a person? Danny, the time to prove that was over the past 7 years, when you thought I was poor and struggling and could offer you nothing but a mother's love. You had countless opportunities to show me that you valued our relationship for its own sake. But I can still show you that now. Now you have a $3 million incentive to be a good son. That's not the same thing as actually being a good son. Bobby was shaking his head in disbelief. I can't believe you're really going to do this. I can't believe you're going to destroy our family over some phone calls and birthday cards. Bobby, I'm not destroying our family. I'm simply acknowledging that our family was destroyed years ago, and I was too blind to see it. That's not true. We're still a family. Are we? When was the last time we acted like one? When was the last time any of you treated me like someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered to you? The question hung in the air. unanswered and unanswerable. Margaret closed her briefcase with a decisive snap. Mrs. Patterson, if you're ready to proceed, I'll prepare the final financial documents for the charitable distributions. I'm ready. Thomas arranged the legal papers in front of me, each page representing the end of my children's expectations and the beginning of their adult reckoning with the consequences of their choices. Mom, please, Susan said one last time. Don't do this. We can work things out. We can rebuild our relationships, but not if you destroy the foundation of trust between us. I looked up from the papers, seeing my eldest daughter clearly for perhaps the first time in years. Susan, the foundation of trust was destroyed when you threatened to challenge my mental competence because you didn't like my decisions about my own money. I didn't mean it like that. You meant it exactly like that. You meant that my feelings and my decisions only matter if they benefit you. I picked up the pen Thomas offered me and began signing the documents that would formalize my decision. Each signature felt like a small death, the death of illusions I'd carried for too long about who my children were and what our relationships meant. When I finished signing, I set down the pen and looked around the table at these 3 adults who'd once been the center of my universe. I want you to understand something, I said quietly. This decision isn't about the money. It's about the fact that none of you have ever seen me as a whole person with my own needs, my own feelings, my own value independent of what I could do for you. That's not true, Danny protested weakly. It is true. For 7 years, you've treated me like a service provider rather than a family member. You've approached our relationship like customers rather than children. You've given me the minimum amount of attention required to avoid feeling guilty, but never enough to actually build a meaningful connection. Susan was crying now, tears streaming down her face as the reality of what had just happened sank in. Mom, you've just cut us out of your life over hurt feelings. Susan, I've just chosen to leave my life's work to people who will value it, rather than to people who have never valued me. Bobby was staring at the signed documents like they were a death sentence. So that's it? $50,000 each, and the rest goes to strangers? The rest goes to organizations that help people in need, organizations that understand the value of human dignity and compassion, things your father and I cared about, things we hoped we'd taught you to care about as well. Marcus had been silent throughout most of the meeting, but now he spoke up with quiet dignity. Mrs. Patterson, I want you to know that I respect your decision even though I'm disappointed by it. I think you're right that we've all taken you for granted, and I'm sorry for my part in that. It was the first genuine apology I'd heard all day, and it came from the person who owed me the least. Thank you, Marcus, I appreciate that. Patricia was sobbing openly now, the reality of their financial situation apparently overwhelming her. What are we going to do? How are we going to tell the children? How are we going to manage the debt? The same way millions of other families manage, I said simply, by living within your means and working for what you want. Thomas gathered up the signed documents and placed them in his briefcase. Mrs. Patterson, these will be filed with the court on Monday morning. The charitable organizations will be notified, and trust accounts will be established for the distributions. And the children's bequests? $50,000 each, to be distributed upon your death, or upon request if you choose to distribute them during your lifetime. I considered this for a moment. Actually, Thomas, let's distribute their bequests today. I'd rather they have the money now, when they can use it, than have to wait for me to die. Danny's face showed a flicker of hope. Does that mean you're reconsidering the rest of it? No, Danny. It means I want to close this chapter of our relationship cleanly. $50,000 each, as a final gesture of the love I've carried for you despite everything. Susan wiped her eyes and tried to regain her composure. Mom, if this is really your final decision, then I suppose we should talk about what happens next. Do you want us to stay in contact? Do you want to try to rebuild our relationships without the inheritance issue hanging over us? It was a fair question, one I'd been thinking about for months. I want what I've always wanted, I said. I want children who love me for who I am, not for what I can give them. I want family members who include me in their lives because they value my presence, not because they feel obligated to tolerate me. And if we can learn to do that, then maybe we can rebuild something real instead of the polite fiction we've been maintaining for years. Bobby stood up slowly, apparently beginning to accept the reality of what had just happened. Mom, I want you to know that I love you, even though I haven't shown it very well. I want to try to be a better son, with or without the inheritance. Bobby, I hope that's true. I hope you can learn to see me as a person worth loving for my own sake. Danny was still crying, but he managed to speak through his tears. Mom, I'm sorry. I'm really truly sorry for everything. I know I've been selfish and irresponsible, and I know saying sorry doesn't fix any of it, but I want you to know that I do love you. I love you too, Danny. I've always loved all of you, but love without respect isn't enough to build a relationship on. Susan gathered her papers and stood up with the dignified bearing she'd learned in courtrooms. Mom, I disagree with your decision, but I respect your right to make it. I hope someday we can find a way back to each other. I hope so too, Susan. As my children prepared to leave, Patricia approached me with red-rimmed eyes and a trembling voice. Dorothy, I know I haven't been the daughter-in-law you deserved, but I want you to know that I'm going to try to do better. Not because of the money, but because you deserve better from all of us. It was perhaps the most honest thing anyone had said all day. Thank you, Patricia. That means more to me than you know. One by one, they filed out of the conference room, leaving me alone with Thomas and Margaret. The silence that followed felt different from the tense quiet during our family meeting. This silence felt peaceful, like the calm after a long-awaited storm. How do you feel? Margaret asked gently. Free, I said, and realized I meant it. For the first time in 7 years, I feel completely free. Thomas was organizing his papers with the methodical precision of someone who'd handled many difficult family situations. Dorothy, you know there's a possibility they'll challenge this will, despite what I said earlier about your testamentary capacity. Let them try. I have 7 years of documentation showing exactly how they've treated me. I have witnesses, I have evidence, and I have the law on my side. And if they do challenge it, then they'll prove once and for all that their relationship with me was always about money, never about love. I stood up and walked to the window one last time, looking out at the town square where Frank and I had spent so many peaceful evenings planning for a future we thought would include grandchildren's laughter and family gatherings filled with genuine affection. Frank would be proud of you today, Margaret said quietly. I think he would. I think he knew this day would come, and he trusted me to handle it with wisdom and strength. Do you think they'll learn from this experience? I considered the question carefully. I hope so. I hope they'll realize that relationships require investment, that love requires action, that family means more than shared genetics and legal obligations. And if they don't, then they'll go on with their lives, and I'll go on with mine. The difference is that I'll be living authentically for the first time in years, while they'll be living with the consequences of their choices. Thomas stood up and extended his hand. Dorothy, it's been an honor representing you today. I hope your decision brings you the peace you deserve. Thank you, Thomas, for everything. As I left the law office that afternoon, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 7 years. Hope. Not hope that my children would suddenly become the people I'd always wanted them to be, but hope that I could finally become the person I'd always been, underneath the layers of disappointment and hurt. I drove home through the familiar streets of Cedar Falls, past the houses where other families were probably sharing Saturday afternoon activities, past the park where Frank and I used to walk, past the grocery store where I'd carefully counted coupons while sitting on millions of dollars. The house on Elm Street looked different when I pulled into the driveway. It was still the same modest 2-bedroom home I'd lived in for 4 decades, but it no longer felt like a prison of pretense. It felt like a choice, a deliberate decision to live simply and authentically, rather than to impress people who didn't value authenticity anyway. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called my neighbor Mrs. Henderson and invited her over for dinner. We sat in my small kitchen eating homemade soup and talking about her grandchildren, her garden, her plans for the upcoming holidays. It was the kind of easy, genuine conversation I'd been missing with my own family for years. Dorothy, you seem different tonight, Mrs. Henderson observed as we cleared the dishes. Lighter somehow. I feel lighter, I admitted. I made some difficult decisions today. but they were the right decisions. Sometimes the right decisions are the hardest ones to make. Yes, they are. That night, I sat in Frank's old recliner with a cup of tea and thought about the road ahead. I was 80 years old, alone in many ways, but not lonely. I had enough money to live comfortably for the rest of my life. I had a house that was truly mine, choices that were entirely my own, and the freedom to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. My phone rang once that evening. It was Emma Thompson, a former student who'd become a successful teacher herself and stayed in touch over the years. She called every few months just to chat, to share stories about her own classroom, to ask for advice about handling difficult parents or challenging curriculum decisions. "Mrs. Patterson, how are you doing? I was just thinking about you today and wanted to check in." We talked for over an hour about her students, my garden, her upcoming marriage, my recent reading. It was the kind of conversation I'd hoped to have with my own children, but had never been able to achieve. Emma valued my thoughts, my experiences, my perspective. She treated me like a whole person, with wisdom worth seeking and stories worth hearing. When we hung up, I realized that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the people who choose to love you for who you are, not for what you can provide. Sunday morning dawned bright and clear, with the kind of autumn air that made everything feel possible. I dressed carefully for church, choosing a simple blue dress that Frank had always complimented me on. I'd been attending services at St. Mark's Presbyterian for 30 years, but today felt different somehow. Pastor Williams delivered a sermon about forgiveness and redemption, about the difference between enabling bad behavior and showing grace to people who'd genuinely changed. As I listened, I thought about my children and wondered if they would learn from yesterday's experience or simply resent me for holding them accountable. After the service, several church members approached me with warmth and genuine interest. Margaret Foster, who organized our monthly book club, invited me to lunch. Tom Bradley, who'd lost his wife last year, asked if I'd like to join him for the community theater production next weekend. Sarah Chen, whose grandchildren attended the elementary school where I'd taught, wanted to know if I'd consider volunteering with their literacy program. These people saw me as a valuable member of their community, someone with skills and wisdom worth sharing. They didn't know about the inheritance decision I'd made yesterday, didn't know about the millions of dollars I'd given away, didn't know about the family drama that had unfolded in Thomas Harrison's conference room. They simply knew me as Dorothy Patterson, retired teacher, church member, neighbor, friend. It occurred to me that I'd been so focused on my children's failure to value me that I'd overlooked all the people who did value me. I had a community of friends and acquaintances who appreciated my contributions, sought my advice, and included me in their activities because they enjoyed my company. I accepted Margaret's lunch invitation, and we spent 2 hours at the corner cafe talking about everything from current events to childhood memories. She listened to my stories about teaching, asked thoughtful questions about my experiences, and shared her own struggles with aging parents and adult children who lived far away. "Dorothy, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you seem different lately," Margaret said as we finished our coffee. "More confident. I don't know, more yourself." "I've been making some changes in my life," I told her. "Learning to prioritize my own well-being instead of always putting other people's needs first." "Good for you. Too many women our age have spent so many years taking care of everyone else that we forget to take care of ourselves." That afternoon, I sat in my garden pulling weeds and thinking about the future. I was 80 years old, which meant I probably had another 10 to 15 years of active, independent living ahead of me. The question was how to make those years meaningful, how to build a life that reflected my values and brought me genuine satisfaction. I thought about traveling, something Frank and I had always planned to do but had postponed because of work obligations and family responsibilities. I could afford to see the world now, to visit places I'd only read about, to experience cultures I'd only studied in books. I thought about volunteering, using my teaching skills to help adults learn to read, or helping immigrant families navigate American educational systems. I could afford to give my time freely to causes I cared about, without worrying about the income I wasn't earning. I thought about hobbies I'd abandoned over the years, Interests I'd set aside when raising children and managing a household consumed all my energy. I could take art classes, learn to play piano, join hiking groups, attend lectures at the university. For the first time in decades, my future belonged entirely to me. Monday morning brought a phone call from Thomas Harrison confirming that all the legal documents had been filed and the charitable distributions were being processed. By the end of the week, several organizations would receive substantial donations that would fund scholarships, medical research, homeless shelters, and educational programs. "Any regrets?" Thomas asked. "None," I said firmly. "This feels right, Thomas. This feels like honoring Frank's memory and my own values." "Have you heard from your children since Saturday?" "Not yet, but I expect I will." I was right. Susan called Tuesday afternoon, her voice carefully controlled in the way that meant she was working hard to manage her emotions. "Mom, I wanted to let you know that Marcus and I have been talking about everything that happened on Saturday, and we realize we owe you a sincere apology." Go on. "We've been so caught up in our own lives, our own stress and responsibilities, that we lost sight of what's really important. We took you for granted, and that was wrong." I waited for her to continue, not wanting to make this easy for her. "I know the inheritance is gone, and I'm not calling to try to change your mind about that. I'm calling because I want to try to rebuild our relationship on a better foundation." "What would that look like, Susan?" "It would look like me calling you regularly, not just when I need something or when guilt finally gets the better of me. It would look like me including you in family decisions and asking for your advice because I value your wisdom, not just because I'm obligated to keep you informed." "And what about Jennifer and Michael? When was the last time I had a real conversation with my grandchildren?" There was a long pause. "You're right. We've been so protective of their time, so focused on their activities and achievements, that we've forgotten they need to know their grandmother as a person, not just as someone who sends birthday cards." "Susan, I appreciate what you're saying, but I need you to understand that this can't be about guilt or obligation. If you're going to be part of my life going forward, it has to be because you genuinely want to be, not because you feel like you should be." "I do want to be, Mom. I want to know you better, to understand who you are beyond just being my mother. I want Jennifer and Michael to have a real relationship with their grandmother, to learn from your experiences and wisdom. Then prove it, Susan. Not with grand gestures or dramatic promises, but with consistent small actions that show you value our relationship." "I will. And Mom, I love you, not because of what you can give me, but because you're my mother, and you deserve to be loved and respected." It was a start. Not a guarantee, not a magical transformation, but a genuine acknowledgement of past mistakes and a commitment to do better. Whether Susan would follow through remained to be seen, but for the first time in years I felt hopeful about the possibility of rebuilding our relationship. Bobby called Wednesday evening, his voice subdued and thoughtful in a way I rarely heard from him. "Mom, I've been doing a lot of thinking since Saturday, and I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you a complete change in how I approach our relationship." "What does that mean, Bobby?" "It means I need to stop treating you like a duty to be managed and start treating you like a person I want to know. It means I need to stop using Patricia and the kids as buffers so I don't have to invest emotionally in our relationship." And what brought about this realization? Honestly? Patricia. She's been furious with me since Saturday, not because of the money, but because she realized that I've been keeping her at arm's length from you two. She wants to have a real relationship with you, but I've never encouraged it because it was easier to keep family obligations superficial. This was more self-awareness than I'd seen from Bobby in years. "Bobby, I want you to understand something. The inheritance decision wasn't about punishing you for past behavior. It was about acknowledging that relationships have value, and that value has to be demonstrated through actions, not just assumed because of blood relations. I understand that now, and I want to earn back your trust, not for financial reasons, but because I miss having a real relationship with my mother. That's going to take time, Bobby. It's going to require consistent effort and genuine interest in my life as a whole person. I know, but I'm willing to put in that effort, for as long as it takes." Danny's call came Friday morning, and it was different from his siblings' conversations. There was no careful control in his voice, No strategic planning. He was raw and honest in a way that was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Mom, I've been a mess since Saturday. Not because of the money, well, not just because of the money, but because I finally understand how selfish I've been. Tell me what you understand, Danny. I understand that for years I've treated you like my personal ATM and emotional dumping ground. I called when I needed money, when I needed advice about my latest disaster, when I needed someone to listen to me complain about how unfair life was. But I never called just to see how you were doing, never asked about your day, your health, your happiness. And why do you think that was? Because I was so wrapped up in my own problems that I forgot you were a real person with your own needs and feelings. I treated you like a resource instead of like my mother. Danny, what are you going to do with that understanding? I'm going to try to be the son you deserved all along. I'm going to call you regularly, not because I need something, but because I want to maintain a relationship with you. I'm going to ask about your life, your interests, your thoughts on things that have nothing to do with me. And what about your financial situation? How are you going to handle that? I'm going to handle it like an adult. I'm going to stop looking for quick fixes and easy money. And I'm going to build a stable life through consistent work and responsible decisions. The $50,000 you're giving me is going to pay off my debts. And then I'm starting fresh with a budget and a plan. I'm glad to hear that, Danny. Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. Are you happy? I mean really happy, not just putting on a brave face? It was such an unexpected question, so genuine and caring, that I felt tears spring to my eyes. Yes, Danny. For the first time in years, I'm genuinely happy. I feel free to be myself, to make choices based on what I want rather than what other people expect from me. Good. You deserve to be happy, Mom. You've spent so many years taking care of everyone else that you forgot to take care of yourself. Thank you for saying that. I love you, Mom, and I'm sorry it took me 45 years to learn how to show it properly. Over the following months, something remarkable happened. My children, freed from the wasisa expectation of a large inheritance, began building genuine relationships with me. Susan started calling every Sunday, not with an agenda, but simply to talk. She brought Jennifer and Michael to visit monthly, and we developed real connections based on shared interests and mutual respect. Bobby began including me in family decisions, asking for my advice on everything from business strategies to parenting challenges. He and Patricia invited me to dinner regularly, and Patricia made genuine efforts to know me as an individual rather than just as Bobby's mother. Danny transformed his life with a determination that surprised everyone, including himself. He found steady work, moved to a better apartment, and began building the stable, responsible life he'd always claimed to want. More importantly, he became the attentive, caring son I'd always hoped he could be. The $50,000 each had received served different purposes for each of them. Susan used hers to reduce the debt that had been causing so much stress in her marriage. Bobby invested his in a conservative portfolio that would provide security without requiring the high-risk strategies that had been keeping him awake at night. Danny used his to clear his debts and establish an emergency fund that gave him the financial stability to make better long-term decisions. None of them mentioned the larger inheritance I'd given away. It was as if that money had never existed, which in many ways was exactly how it should be. The charitable organizations I'd chosen were putting the funds to excellent use, funding scholarships for disadvantaged students, supporting medical research, and providing services for homeless families. 6 months after that dramatic Saturday in Thomas Harrison's conference room, I received a letter that brought tears to my eyes. It was from Maria Santos, a young woman who'd received one of the educational scholarships funded by my donation. She was the first person in her family to attend college, studying to become a teacher, inspired by the opportunities that education had provided her. Dear Mrs. Patterson, the letter read, I will never be able to thank you enough for the gift you've given me, not just the financial support, but the belief that someone like me deserves a chance to build a better life through education. I promise to honor your generosity by working hard, graduating with honors, and spending my career helping other students discover their own potential. That letter and others like it confirmed that I'd made the right decision. My money was helping people who understood its value, people who would use it to build better lives and stronger communities. As for my children, They were learning something more valuable than any inheritance. That relationships built on mutual respect and genuine affection are worth more than money. That love expressed through consistent actions is more precious than any financial gift. And that the greatest inheritance parents can leave their children is the example of how to live with integrity, compassion, and purpose. On my 81st birthday, I woke up to a house filled with flowers, cards, and the sounds of my family preparing a celebration lunch. Susan had taken the day off work. Bobby had cleared his schedule. Danny had driven down from his new apartment. My grandchildren had made handmade gifts and were excited to share their school projects with me. As we sat around my dining room table sharing stories and laughter, I thought about Frank and how proud he would be of the family we'd raised. Not perfect people, but people who'd learned from their mistakes and chosen to become better versions of themselves. The test was over. We'd all passed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.